Are men and boys in crisis? Many social scientists agree that contemporary American men are mired in malaise. Richard Reeves, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, explores several key challenges facing boys and men in his latest book, Of Boys and Men: Why Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. And he joins us now via Zoom. Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula.
This is such an important topic, and you explore in your book that one of the big ways boys and men have fallen behind is in terms of education. And can you shed some light on what your research found?
Sure. If we start on college campuses, I suspect many people now know that there are many more women on college campuses today than there are men. There's about a 60-40 gap in terms of getting those college degrees, which is actually the reverse of the inequality we had 50 years ago. So some people will remember that 50 years ago, we passed Title IX to really help women and girls into education. It was necessary and it was successful. But now the inequality is reversed. So we actually have a bigger gender gap on college campuses today than we did 50 years ago. It's just the other way around. And that reflects what's happening in high schools. If you take the top 10% of high school performers, 2/3 of them are girls, and the bottom 10%, 2/3 of them are boys. And girls just start school, even at the age of 5 or 6. There are some very big gender gaps in school readiness. So all the way through, from K all the way through bachelor's and beyond, there's now a very big gender gap in education.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Girls are killing it. I mean, anybody who observes a school will tell you that. And do you think that in an effort to bolster the success of girls since the onset of the women's movement, in some way, boys have been neglected?
Well, the first thing to say is you're right. When you share these statistics, every parent and every educator says, well, duh, tell me something I don't know. We don't need a Brookings scholar to tell us that. It's obvious. The question then is really why? And some people do worry about this balance in the investment between women and girls and boys and men. My research suggests that to some extent, girls and women just are at a structural advantage in the education system because their brains develop earlier. They're a little bit more mature just in that neurological sense. And that was always true. It's just that we couldn't see that under conditions of sexism. It wasn't that long ago that girls weren't encouraged to go on to college or do well educationally. And so I think it just took the removal of those barriers that were placed, artificial barriers, in front of women and girls to reveal the fact that actually they do have some natural advantages in the classroom. But I think those natural advantages are probably getting greater as we shift towards a more female teaching workforce. Every year, we tilt a little bit more towards female teachers. Some of the learning styles are more female-friendly than male-friendly. But I think the big thing is simply that just girls' brains develop faster than boys.
Sure. And really the troubling effect is that this inevitably will have an effect on men in the job market.
Right. I mean, one of the things we all agree on is that a good quality education of different kinds is increasingly important. And so the fact we're seeing this wide and growing gender gap in education should be troubling to us in either direction. We should be absolutely worried if girls and women are falling behind boys and men, which they were for a long time, and we should act. But the same should be true the other way around, because one of our big economic problems is the declining participation in the workforce of men. We're seeing fewer and fewer men in the workforce, and that's a problem for families. It's a problem for women who end up doing even more work. They end up, in a sense, doing two jobs, right? The job of dad's job and mum's job, if you want to use those traditional labels. And it's bad for the economy because we're just leaving a lot of talent on the table.
Well, yeah, it is interesting in terms of the culture. I know Professor Scott Galloway at NYU talks about how the fact that women will marry at their economic status and above, and that puts so many men at a disadvantage then, right? If they don't have a college degree, it really is going to affect the country in the decades to come.
Yeah, we'll see how that actually plays out. I don't think we know yet, honestly, how this education gap is going to play out in terms of marriage, because it's still true that there are some jobs that are more male where you can make a decent living even with less education. And I'm not convinced yet that, say, for example, a nurse is going to be unwilling to marry a plumber. Right, so long as that plumber's doing well. I think the deeper problem here, Paula, is that too many men feel like they're not needed really by anybody. The labor market, maybe not by their families, maybe not by society, that there's this The most damaging thing to human psychology, I think, is feeling unneeded. And too many of our men just feel benched, effectively, like they're not necessary. And that's a much deeper cultural problem. I think many of these the data points we're talking about now, education and employment, are actually symptoms of something much deeper, which is this question of, like, what am I supposed to do as a man today? And we're not doing a very good job of answering that question, especially for our boys and young men. And they'll find other answers online if we're not careful. In fact, they already are.
Yeah, I have to tell you, it really irritates me just in terms of advertising as a wife, as a mother of sons. In almost every commercial, the mother is portrayed as a successful superstar and the dad is an idiot. And the children are generally laughing at dad. So you talk about this in your book, which I find fascinating, that the whole concept of fatherhood changed in recent years. My father certainly never changed a diaper, but now, of course, that's very different. But this has had an effect on men, and as you put it, their sense of purpose.
Yeah, what's happening is that there's just this really difficult moment in our culture of catching up. So very, very recently, the role of the dad was primarily breadwinner. That was certainly my father's role, and he may have changed the odd diaper. I don't know. I'd have to check with them. But certainly it was clear that my mum's role was the main role was caregiver, my dad's as breadwinner. And in the blink of an eye, in historical terms, that's not true anymore. 50% of women earn more than the typical man. 40% of women, and 40% of breadwinners are now female. And so that unique role of fathers as breadwinner has gone. And that's good because it means that we're getting closer to gender equality. What's bad is that we haven't replaced it with this newer fatherhood role. So I feel men are basically stuck between being unable to complete the role their fathers had, but not yet adjusting into this new role. And I think men and women, in fact, society as a whole, has to do a much better job of reinventing fatherhood without in any way displacing it.
You know, we know the effect of social media, screen time on all of us in terms of isolation and loneliness. But you talk about the friendship recession among men. Talk about that and the percentage of men who report having absolutely no close friends. And this has gone up since the 90s. What's behind this?
Sure. The whole issue of isolation and loneliness is getting a lot more attention now. Just in recent weeks, we saw the US Surgeon General making loneliness essentially his leading issue is public health. And we know that actually being lonely can be very damaging for your health. On some measures, being without a friend or being lonely is as bad for you as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day. So it has physical health as well as the psychological ones you refer to. And so there is a decline in friendship, but much more so for men than for women. So among young men today, 15% say that they don't have a close friend. That's one in 7. That's up from 3% in 1990. Wow. And so this is it's true for men and women, but it's much worse for men. And so this isolation, this disconnection, this uncertainty, is leaving so many men, especially young men, really uncertain of what their purpose should be. And as a culture, my fear is that we very often told men, especially young men, what they're supposed to not do. There's a long list of don'ts for men today. And by the way, most of those are very important. Don't say this, don't look at this, don't do that, etc. But what about the do's? What's the to-do list for young men today? It was very clear a generation ago what that was. It's not clear today, and it shouldn't be any surprise that so many men feel lost, and lost men are vulnerable. It's
a tragic situation to think about. So let's try to end on a somewhat positive note. How do we go about fixing some of these ways that boys and men have fallen behind?
Well, that's the good news. If we start to recognize now that there really is an issue here for many of our boys and men, and we're just willing collectively to address it, we can do stuff. So in education, for example, we should consider starting boys in school a year later to give them that extra year to mature, or certainly giving them more pre-K. Interestingly, a Boston pre-K study found that pre-K was much more effective for boys than for girls, for the reasons that we've discussed. More male teachers, more vocational education, more technical high schools, that really seems to work for boys. More paid leave for dads, so that we're saying to dads, you matter, you should take time off to look after your own children. That's not just mum's work. And then reforms in the labour market generally. Investments in infrastructure are particularly good for men as well. And I would love to see us working as hard to get more men into these growing professions of health, teaching, social care, as we have worked to get women into the traditionally male roles of STEM, law, etc. Because we need more teachers and nurses and healthcare workers. And right now we're trying to solve those problems with half the workforce. So let's have a national effort to get more men into those growing professions.
Yeah, it's so important, and we need to pay attention. Richard Reeves, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, the author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula.